Obviously, this would be huge for the LTSC, and I know these conversations are confidential, but what can you tell us about the likelihood of Airbnb doing this with you?
I can't speak to which companies are going to list. All those conversations are confidential. So unfortunately, I can't say anything about that.
That said, if this were to happen with Airbnb or a company of similar size, what kind of, legitimizing force would that have on, something that you've been working on for a long time and sort of been waiting for a company to make this move?
Well, I have been working on this for the better part of a decade. That's true. And, we're really excited that we were able to begin trading operations just on September 9th. So that is kind of the official start time for us to be able to have these conversations with companies. And, separate from any particular company, I think what's really important is the issues of corporate governance. In this next generation, there are really incredible corporate leaders like Brian, who you mentioned, who are really committed to a 21st century way of building companies that is different than what's come before. And our goal is simply to create a venue that is appropriate to their standards.
Now, you built a business on a best-selling book and a methodology, and I know you built a lot of strong relationships with founders, like people like Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky. Talk to us about your relationship with those kind of founders and how the kind of conversations you're having with them about making a decision like this.
It's a bit of a cliche now to think that people in Silicon Valley are trying to change the world. But as I've gotten to know people like Brian Chesky, I really think they are sincerely committed to it. I know he cares a lot about diversity, sustainability, what he calls multi-stakeholder way of building a company, his hosts, his guests, and understands that taking care of the human beings in his community ultimately leads to success for shareholders too. So if you look at the actions that these next generation leaders are taking, you don't just have to take their word for it. He launched a few weeks ago the Host Endowment Fund, placing a significant amount of the company's stock into almost like a sovereign wealth fund for Airbnb Nation, if you will. And I think this recognition that these platforms, not just Airbnb, but many of this next generation companies, these platforms are so powerful, they're like nation states unto themselves. And so the leaders of those platforms have a tremendous civic responsibility to shape what the 21st century is going to look like.
Now, we just learned that Roblox, the gaming company, has filed for an IPO to list on the New York Stock Exchange. Talk to us about the selling point of the long-term stock exchange. Why should an Airbnb CEO or Roblox or DoorDash or Affirm or any of these companies that are planning to get out of the gate later this year choose you? And what are they giving up if they don't go that traditional route?
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that we're asking companies to dual list so they can still have a primary listing on NASDAQ or NYSE. We would not set the open and close price, and we don't affect their access to liquidity. So none of the conventional things that companies seek to gain in an IPO would be lost by dual listing on LTSE. So the risk is actually quite low. One of the things that pretty much everyone in business agrees on is that short-term thinking has become an epidemic problem. And just look outside if you want to see the consequences of that. And so when you talk to managers at public companies, they increasingly are finding themselves living quarter to quarter. They struggle to make the right investments, to focus on the long term. Investments in innovation and R&D get starved. And that's not what this next generation of company leaders wants in their public markets experience. So, as we've seen throughout the pandemic, the companies that have this longer term focus, this philosophy, they're better equipped to deal with disruption. They're better taking care of their employees and customers, who you better believe are going to remember in the new normal who was there for them and who wasn't. So I think this capability to adapt while remaining true to their vision, that is the essence of this next generation of leadership. And the standards that we have embedded into the long-term stock exchange are aligned with that ethos.
Now, it's been an unprecedented year. We've got a lot of pent-up IPO demand over the next several weeks. We'll see how many of those companies actually make it out of the gate. What's your forecast for 2021? Do we go back to some kind of normal after this unprecedented time, or just does this kind of feeling of disruption continue for a while?
It's funny to think that the 21st century is already 1/5 over, but anyone who thinks that it's going to be smoother or calmer in the years to come, I think, is not paying attention. We're basically 100 years removed from what our grandparents and great-grandparents went through. You remember the roaring 20s of the 20th century? I think when the pandemic ends, the activity that's going to be unleashed here is going to make the Roaring Twenties look quaint by comparison. But we have to learn the lessons, the civic lessons that they had to learn the hard way. If everyone remembers what happened in the 20s, but then also the 30s and the 40s, we're headed on a similar trajectory if we don't make the civic investments now that will allow us to build broadly shared prosperity throughout our society. So I do think that entrepreneurs and especially tech leaders have an important role to play in forging that new consensus, but it's going to require a kind of enlightened thinking about what is it? What is the role of a corporation? What is the purpose of a corporation in these turbulent times? And I think if we get that right, I think if we can really lay out the new ground rules, the new social contract of what it means to be a great company, we all have a role to play in that, in the press and those of us who advise companies, and of course the founders themselves, in saying that these new companies, this new ethos has got to be about taking care of human beings and the societies they inhabit, or we're going to have a repeat of some of the atrocities we saw last century.